Hello, everyone. It's Dan Tannick here from the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. Thanks very much for joining us for our first webinar of 2019. We have a pretty good presentation this morning. I think everybody will find it pretty interesting. And we also have a full slate of presentations coming up over the next few months. So keep an eye on your inboxes. Before we get started with our presenter today, Rebecca Elliott from the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, I should let attendees know that our next Friday Forum will be on February 22nd. We'll have Jackie Yip from KWL, and she'll be talking about sea level rise and doing climate change adaptation planning using uncertain information. So we're very happy to have Rebecca Elliott here, who's a flood risk management engineer with the TRCA. I think probably most people on the line are familiar with TRCA, but it's one of the most important watershed management organizations in the country. They provide many different services related to watersheds throughout the Greater Toronto area, and one important role they play is playing a very central role in flood risk management, and they've been doing a great deal of very progressive work on the topic and serving the many millions of residents in the GTA. So we're very happy to hear from Rebecca about some of this work. And with that, actually, before we get started, I just want to remind people how to ask questions. So if you've participated in our webinars in the past, you'll know to use the question and answer function that you'll find in the taskbar for the webinar software. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar, but we'll hold all the questions until the end, where we'll save some time for a good discussion. So with that, I'll pass it to Rebecca.
Well, thank you very much, Dan, for the introduction and for the opportunity to present our exciting work that we do here at the TRCA. So my presentation outline for today is I'm going to talk about the history of the TRCA, a little bit about Flooding 101, our flood forecasting and warning program, and just some of the projects that we're doing and some of the progressive work like you mentioned, and then recommendations and questions afterwards. So with that, the history of the TRCA. So the TRCA was brought out from the Conservation Authorities Act, which was established in 1946 under the Act, which mentions that to ensure conservation, restoration, and responsible management of hydrological features through programs that balance human, environmental, and economic needs. So really, this was done, a lot of people think that we came about from Hurricane Hazel, which I'll mention in a second, but really this was established in 1946. And we were made up of a bunch of smaller conservation authorities. So there was the Etobicoke-Mimico, Humber River, Don River, and the Rouge, Duffins, Highland, and Petticoat conservation authorities. And then, like I mentioned, in October 1954, everything changed. So Hurricane Hazel hit on October 15th and 16th of 1954. So it dumped about 210 millimeters of rain in the Toronto region within 12 hours. And over the course of 60 hours, the rain totals were about 285 millimeters, with the highest rainfall in Snell Grove, Ontario, which is kind of near Brampton, Mayfield area. So the flows in the Humber River were 4 times greater than previously recorded at all. And it caused a lot of devastation, including 81 deaths just in the Toronto area. Bridges on the west side were destroyed. Some roads were completely washed out. So as you can see, these are some black and white images from Hurricane Hazel, and the bottom left-hand corner is Raymore Drive, which is in the Humber Valley, and it was completely washed out. So from there, the Metropolitan Toronto and Region Conservation Authority was formed in 1957, which amalgamated all of those 4 smaller conservation authorities. And we had an amendment to the Conservation Authority Act to require, for the ability to acquire lands for recreational and conservation purposes. And then in 1959, the Toronto Region Conservation, or the MTRCA, put out this plan for flood control and water conservation, where the focuses were on property acquisition for areas way down in the floodplain, control structures like dams and channels, and then land use planning. So property acquisition. So this is that Raymore Drive I mentioned where a lot of homes were washed away. The implementation of the Lands Acquisition Program in 1960 was the first official stage of this plan. And the intent of this program was to transfer the liability of the floodplain from private lands to the authorities so that people would get out of those really vulnerable and risky areas. So over time, you can see this is a picture from the 1959 plan, and it also shows that a lot of the green spaces follow the rivers and channels. So we acquired a lot of the lands right next to the floodplains. And this was the plan to for the flood control infrastructure. There was 15 large control dams that were identified in the 1959 plan. However, only 5 structures were actually built. So we have Clairville Dam and Gibras Dam, which are the big ones in our area. And these are some of the ones that were actually built, like Stouffville, and some of the other little ones, Milne Dam. So, and this is what we actually have to date, where we have Clairville Dam in Brampton, which is actually provides control for the Toronto area, and then Gibras Dam. So flood control for infrastructure, the channels we have, they were built quickly to convey the floodwaters away from the high-risk areas. This kind of relates and results in very flashy watersheds and can sometimes exacerbate the situation downstream because people then were building these channels to take water away from risky areas, not realizing if you move the water from that area, it'll get downstream and impact those downstream areas faster as well. So some of those areas downstream didn't have the ability to handle this faster water. So there was some negative ecological impacts. So now we've moved away from this type of infrastructure, but it does help move the water away quickly, and it was part of the 1959 plan. And then we have land use planning. So this is our document it's called the Living City Policies for Planning and Development. So for any development in the watersheds of Toronto Region Conservation Authority, these are the policies that dictate the rules, how you can develop, where you can develop, and some of those very important policies. So these are our watersheds. So we have 9 large watersheds, sub-watersheds in our area, and sometimes considered 10. So we have Etobicoke, Mamico. The largest of our watersheds is the Humber River, the Don, the Highland, the Rouge, Petticoat, Duffins, Carruthers, and then a very small kind of right on the lake, or right on the shoreline of Frenchman's Bay. So a watershed is an area that drains to a river system, and all of the river systems drain to Lake Ontario. So we have in our jurisdiction about 3,500 square kilometers to about 2,500 on land and about 960 water-based square kilometers. More than half of our area is urbanized, so it results in short watersheds, and that also means they're flashy. So this is an image that we produced for comparing the areas from the Calgary floods and the Toronto floods. So I'm not sure if you can all remember, but in 2013, Calgary in about June, they experienced a really heavy flood. And we also experienced one later that year. So people asked us, well, is Calgary the same as Toronto? So you can see the red area is the drainage area for the Bow River in Calgary. And the blue area is the GT area, or Toronto Region jurisdiction. So Calgary has about 12 hours of lead time, and we have about hours sometimes to respond and have ability to give notification for our flooding in our area. So just a little bit about flooding. Floods happen, and they happen often. So flood risk is a function of probability and consequence. And from this graphic, you can see that time and time again, flooding seems to be the most important or most frequent of natural disasters. And from a quote from one of the documents put out by Partners for Action, flooding within urban centers is Canadians' costliest and fastest growing extreme weather challenge. Insurable claims in Canada have risen from an average of about 405 million per year between 1983 and 2008 to an average of 1.8 billion per year between 2009 and 2017, with flooding contributing to the greatest proportion of this increase. So some of the extreme weather and flooding that we've had so we have Hazel in 1954, which I previously mentioned. We have the flooding event in 1989, which hit Harrow, Ontario. And then we have the Peterborough storm of 2004. And then August 19th in 2005, right in our jurisdiction, Finch Avenue collapsed as one of the main pictures that people remember from this storm event. July 8th, 2013, I kind of alluded to this one a little bit earlier. This one is where I'm sure people remember the GO train. People had to be rescued from the GO train. There was a lot of cars left underneath underpasses and everything, so it caused a lot of both river and urban flooding. And then even just this year, August 7th, 2018, we had a lot of urban flooding and very localized flooding in our jurisdiction. So what is flooding? Flooding is where you have a river and the flat areas outside where the water comes up over the banks and gets into the floodplain. So that's what we would say when we say flooding. And this is an image of where you can't even see where the channel is anymore. The water has come up over the banks and just filled in that low-lying area beside the river. So types of flooding. Riverine flooding is a partial or complete inundation of a floodplain caused by bank overtopping when the conveyance capacity of rivers and streams is exceeded. And then we have urban or pluvial flooding, where the inundation of a built environment caused by rainfall overwhelms the capacity of drainage systems, such as storm sewers and roads. So comparing them, riverine flooding falls under the mandate of the conservation authorities. So we're very concerned about riverine flooding, whereas the urban flooding is a responsibility of the municipalities. Of course, they both go hand in hand, and we work very closely with our partner municipalities to help them out. But whereas we have the information of the flooding of the rivers, they have all the information on the sewer capacities and where all the sewers are in their municipalities. So again, what causes flooding? Water falling as precipitation and making its way to rivers as surface and groundwater flow is part of the hydrologic cycle. When the rain falls on the ground or when the snow melts, water either infiltrates the soil or becomes surface flow, also known as runoff. Surface flow rapidly travels from overland and through storm sewers, reaching watercourses and causing water levels within the rivers to rise quickly. Factors that contribute to flooding include the amount of surface runoff as well as the characteristics of the watershed itself. Percent of impervious surfaces, soil types, slopes, etc. Due to the urban nature of the GTA, much of the rainfall becomes runoff in our area, causing water levels in streams and rivers to rise really quickly. Watersheds with these characteristics, like I said before, are called flashy watersheds. So why does it seem to be getting worse? Everyone says flooding is getting worse. Why does it seem to be getting worse? Well, climate change. Recalling the hydrologic cycle diagram, storms are getting more unpredictable with potentially more intense and more often. This is a case for the hazard increasing. Land use changes, whatever the amount of rainfall is, in a more urbanized land use, one with more paving and impervious areas, the more rainfall is expected to make its way to rivers as runoff. And then we seem to be putting higher exposure. We seem to be putting more people at risk and more items at risk. People have more items that they're putting in these floodplain areas, so that seems to be contributing to what makes it worse. So who deals with these floods? So this diagram shows that municipalities, they deal with all major emergencies and are responsible for the welfare of the residents. So they're the ones who go out and they're the responders. They declare emergencies, and we work very closely with them. We operate a flood forecasting and warning system. Conservation authorities provide an advisory role to the municipalities. And then the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry can coordinate a response in support of the municipal action. So the municipal role and responsibilities. So they notify appropriate municipal officials in accordance with their emergency plan. They determine the appropriate response to a flood threat and deploy resources to protect life and property. If required, they can declare an emergency and implement the emergency response plan. They can request provincial assistance, and they maintain liaison with Conservation Authority flood duty officers. The provincial role. They operate and maintain provincial flood forecasting and warning systems to alert districts and conservation authorities of potential hazards, maintain communications with all districts and conservation authorities, receive messages from conservation authorities and other districts, and they may also operate a flood forecasting warning system for local storm conditions where conservation authorities do not exist. And then individuals. So this is where I think a lot of people don't know is that they also have a part to play in, any emergency, not just flooding. It's important for everybody to know that 72 hours is the amount of time people are emergency plans say for an individual to be prepared, before any emergency responders will be able to help them. So making an emergency response plan with the loved ones, having a to-go bag, understanding risks, preparing for the risks is really important to reduce the likelihood of flood damage. And then also, it's very important people follow directions of local emergency responders. So conservation authorities' role. We operate a flood forecasting and warning program where we monitor watershed and weather conditions and operate the system. We issue flood messages. We operate a conservation authority dams and flood control infrastructure, provide advice to municipalities, and maintain liaison and communications with municipalities and other agencies. So this is an image of our monitoring network. We collect data through field equipment, water elevation or level as measured by stream and dam gauges every 15 minutes at specific locations. Precipitation amounts are measured every 5 minutes by a rain gauge at specific locations. And these real-time gauges are equipped with a cellular modem that is able to transmit the data to a computer, and we can get it in real time. The rainfall and water data is collected throughout TRCA at a bunch of different locations. And then this is just an image on the left is our field equipment for precipitation, and the other one is a stream data collector. And this image shows our new revamped TRCA monitoring website. If you go to trcagaging.ca, it is our old website. This one will be probably put out in the new year very soon. And it shows a bunch of different conditions and how we can monitor at TRCA all the water conditions in real time. So the different displays and features help our flood staff monitor the weather and watershed conditions. And the municipalities and public will also have access to this website. They have access to the other one as well. And everyone will be able to create their own accounts and be able to create their own dashboards for the municipality and area that they're most interested in as well. So our flood message types that we issue. So if it's a normal day and normal conditions, it'll be a green. The next level up is our watershed condition statements. So water safety is more issued for high banks, melting ice, or other factors that could be dangerous for recreational users, anglers and canoeists, in recreational situations. And then early notice of the potential of flooding based on weather forecasts and, if it's going to be heavy rain predicted in the future, some snow melt, high wind, or anything like that, we will put out a flood outlook statement. The next one is a flood watch. So flooding is possible in specific water courses or municipalities. Certain areas are at risk, or even a big system coming where we're not sure exactly of its course, we might put out a flood watch. And then a flood warning is put out where flooding is imminent or already occurring in certain specific water courses or municipalities. So just some information, we don't have to go in order for these watches. They can start at a normal level, go right to a flood warning. However, watches and warnings require cancellations. And last year we had 32 messages issued total, 16 water safety messages, 9 flood outlook, 4 flood watches with cancellations, 1 flood warning, and then we have shoreline hazard warnings and spring media messages. So I'll get into the shoreline hazard warnings a little bit later. But this year and just this week, we've had 2 water safety condition statement and 1 flood watch. So just an interesting bit of tidbit we have. And then we issue our messages through email where people can self-subscribe, and we send it to, school boards, municipalities, other conservation authorities, police, emergency responders. We're on the media sometimes promoting our, safety in water courses and streams. We have our widget on our website for trca.ca, and then we also have text messages as well. So when is flooding season? Well, for us at the TRCA, it's any time of the year. So We have spring, summer, fall, winter. We're always monitoring. We have 24/7 coverage from our flood duty officers. We're monitoring rain on snow events like we've had earlier this week, also potential for ice jams in the winter. In the spring, we have spring freshet and spring showers that we're worried about. Summer convective thunderstorms. These ones are really hard to have prediction before. They're very unpredictable. They can drop lots of rain in very short periods of time. For example, like I mentioned, August 7th this past year, we had a lot of rain, very localized rainstorm on top of North York. So you can see this is from our water rain gauges. The water is very high up in the channel with the graphs as well. And these are some of the pictures that were taken from the local Facebook website for the Rockcliffe area in Toronto. This is the website. This is an image showing where the heaviest rain fell, where it's really red, and then the rest of the jurisdiction hardly got any rain at all. And so then we also have to worry about hurricanes, the remnants of hurricanes coming through. Hurricane season is officially from June 1st to November 30th each year. So we're always keeping an eye on the storms that come up through the states for remnant storms, and that can produce heavy rainfall in our jurisdiction as well. So all that said and done, what else do we do as the TRCA? What are we doing all the time? So we have these flood risk management projects that we do to help inform our flood forecasting and warning program and help provide extra information out for it. So we have our flood risk assessment and ranking project, which we're almost complete for this year. We've done a Toronto Islands characterization and risk assessment, and then we have some flood remediation studies as well as our outreach program. So what's at risk in the TRCA jurisdiction? So we have 41 flood vulnerable clusters, which are historically known. We have almost 4,200 residents affected in the regulatory storm event, almost the same amount of employees, almost 10,000 buildings affected, and almost 200 kilometers of impassable roads. So prioritizing mitigation at a neighborhood scale is really important for us. Our system is highly branched. It's very hard to know for one area, solving one problem won't help the others. So we wanted to characterize the level of what the risk is in the jurisdiction. So flood characterization can be done. We can do prevention. So land use planning and the land expropriation, which I mentioned earlier. We have remediation, so we can build berms, ponds, or flood-proof homes. And where those two fail, then it's preparedness, flood forecasting and warning, and emergency response plans. But in order to do any of that, we have to know what exactly is impacted, how often will it be impacted, how severe is the impact, and how can we mitigate these impacts. So this is the information we need for standard risk model. So for flood risk, we look at the hazard itself. So the probability that it'll occur and the extent that it'll occur at. Exposure, so the actual things themselves that are at risk, or contents, building contents, and the population. And then we look at vulnerability. So the tangibles, the amount that you can actually quantify in damages, the actual contents inside, and the intangibles. The intangibles are like social impacts, people impacts. So things that you can't put a dollar amount to. So the hazard itself. So we look at probability and extent, like I said. So there are design storms. So we look at how much does it occur. So we look at the different modeling, hydrology, hydraulics. We look at flood hazard mapping. So what do we mean when we say 1 in 100 year storm? So it's saying that we have a 1% chance of this intensity of storm, millimeters per hour, occurring every year where you are standing. So there could be a 100-year storm right where we're standing right now. I'm in Vaughan. There could be another 100-year storm in Windsor. So it seems like it's happening more frequently, but it's happening, it could happen everywhere because it's where we're actually standing is what we're talking about. And then this is kind of an example of some flood mapping extents that we have. So also looking at this diagram, you can see where it's red and orange is the more frequent storm events out to the regulatory storm or the regional storm, which is in the green, and that's the ones that are the worst and maximal probable storm that we have, which is Hurricane Hazel, but it won't happen that frequently. And then we look at the exposure, so building footprints within the flood extents, roads within the flood extents, populations, and flood death statistics, and that helps us understand the actual exposure itself, what's at risk. So we can look at that same area. So right now we can see, we can break it down, the residential, commercial, industrial, and institutional areas that are at risk as we go up to each storm event. So you can see at the 100-year, 350, and regional storm event, the buildings themselves that are affected in the storm. And then we look at the vulnerability, so the tangible damages. So we look at direct damages, structure and content damages, and then we look at indirect damages, so the population displacement and the building disruption and loss of revenue should, buildings have to close, businesses have to stop working because of a flood. And then we look at the intangible damages. So we have social vulnerability, community impacts, and infrastructure. So these are impacts that cannot easily be quantified by dollar amounts, and impacts that are assessed for each return period where they're applicable. So social vulnerability is kind of the number of affected residents and used as a base. So while economic damage to residential buildings in part does serve to take human element into consideration, it also serves to overemphasize the larger, more expensive homes and can often be dwarfed in comparison to economic damages to commercial and industrial buildings. So the vulnerability to people during flood extents beyond personal economic loss includes risk to loss of life as well as increased physical and mental stress beyond the duration of a flood. Quantifying social vulnerability is therefore very important, heavily weighted proportion of the flood risk assessment. So we've looked at residents were considered affected if the first floor of their residence was subject to flooding. Using StatsCan data in conjunction with MPAC, we were able to estimate the number of residents per building, and then this number of residents was summed up for each return period for each structure at each cluster. And then we have an average annual number of affected residents quantified by plotting the number of affected residents versus probability of occurrence and taking the area under the curve. So it's a bit hard to understand, but we just, use this as a base for how we could calculate social vulnerability. So we also, weighted income, family type, age, whether they're a distance from a hospital or a care facility, and housing tenure as well. So for income, the proportion of households with incomes under 20,000 were weighted a bit higher. Family type, so proportions of families with children were weighted heavier. If you had a proportion of residents over 65 years old, whereas they may have experienced a flood before, we kind of realized that this might have, a proxy for underlying health conditions, distance from hospitals, and if you own your home as well, you might have a less weight or more weight than if you were owner occupied if you're renting. So community impacts. So these are the impacted buildings that provide additional services to the community were counted at each return period. So for this, we looked at the average annual number of impacted community services for each cluster. So these are the buildings that not only serve community after floods, but often act as critical resources or places where people can go during a flood. So emergency services buildings, are they impacted? Recreational facilities, maybe people might be directed there during a flood. So if they're underwater, where are people going to go? Places of worship, schools, and community centers as well. In addition, we looked at the loss of community service from infrastructure disruption. So we focused on safe access and egress due to inundation of roads. Flood depth and velocity statistics were calculated at each road segment to determine whether they'd be impassable or whether they'd be safe for roads. So the two metrics used to rank disruption to roads at each cluster were whether it was impassable, so that's flood depths greater than 0.3 or greater than 4.5 meters per second, or on average annual overall inundation extent of the roads. So that means the flood depth times the length. And this was kind of classified based on each local, collector, arterial, or freeway classification of roads. And then we also, disruption of utilities was added as a placeholder category for future consideration. It wasn't in this project specifically, but we do realize it's very important, and so we left this as a placeholder. So for if we ever do this again, we can look into this information. So what did we do with all this data? So we took all the building associated data, so that's tangible, the actual dollar amount values, the social vulnerability, community impacts, and infrastructure, and classified them as an average annual damage cost for each structure and or cluster. So I'm going to go take a step back. What do we mean when we say average annual damages? So certain numbers of our clusters they're only impacted or vulnerable during really large but infrequent storm events like 350, 100-year regional events. Other clusters are more vulnerable during smaller, more frequent storm events. So how can we look at these the same way and understand them and be able to, compare them against each other, make them more of instead of an apples and oranges comparison, just make them all apples. So the purpose of this is to weight damages according to the probability that they'll occur. And they're determined by computing the area under the damage probability curve. So you can see here, a large proportion of anticipated flood damages at this specific cluster would result of smaller, more frequent storm events from the 25 to the 2-year storm event. There's still a proportion that will occur from the 25 to the regional, but majority of it is the lower storm events. So what did we get here? So these are the TRCA's top 10 clusters weighted based on the damages, all over damages. So we have Rockcliffe in Toronto, Jane and Wilson in Toronto, Dixie, Dundas and Mississauga, Pickering Village and Pickering Ajax, Bolton, Court and Caledon, Avondale, Spring Creek in Brampton, Progress Business Park in Toronto, Verdun in Toronto, Lake Wilcox and Richmond Hill, and Markham Industrial and the city of Markham. So what can we do with this information? What kind of statistics can we pull for our study? So for the highest classification, the Rockcliffe, we can pull this kind of information. So there's 3,400 residents affected, almost 1,200 employees affected, 700 buildings affected. We have 8.9 million average annual building-related damages and 75 road segments without access. And the graph on the bottom shows that it's the highest intangible damages, and also the intangible damages are very high. Social vulnerability and infrastructure being two of the highest categories there. And if we break down some of the tangible damages that we can look at, this shows some of the structural content damages for residential compared to non-residential. Residential damages in, the purple color, and the red would be the non-residential for the top 5 tangible damages clusters. And then for our internal TRCA use, we were able to produce these cluster fact sheets that give us a quick snapshot pictures of our jurisdiction, shows the rankings and some of the quick numbers for our area. So now I'm going to go into a little bit other study that we use this kind of same sort of format for is Lake Ontario flooding situation that happened in 2017. I'm sure everyone's aware of it. So the lead up to this, prior to 2017, we didn't have any recorded shoreline hazard message issuance in our jurisdiction. Our primary focus was on riverine flooding, similar, and in our contingency manual, which we put out to municipalities every year, we mentioned it, but a lot of us hadn't actually put one out. So then we have the situation, the Lake Ontario flooding. So our first notice of high lake levels was issued in mid-April of 2017 at Ashbridges Bay Beach volleyball courts. And then our TRCA response. Well, I want to highlight we don't usually respond. We're not the agencies that go out and do sandbagging. We were requested specifically by the City of Toronto Parks Department. So a lot of the TRCA did actually go out and help them. So many groups and dozens of people in TRCA helped with the response and recovery during and after the flooding. And our flood risk management team was only a very small portion of people helping out with these efforts. So our team, what did we do? So we began referencing shoreline impacts in our flood messages starting on April 27th of 2017. And then a special statement was posted in May 2nd of that year as well, a specific shoreline hazard warning. So some of the impacts that we're seeing: Toronto waterfront parks, erosion damage and debris accumulations. Right on the islands, about 30 businesses and 2 schools were impacted. You can see all the damages to the 800 residents that were impacted. So there was a approximate net loss from April to July of $4.9 million. So what have we done since 2017, since this flooding event? Well, we use early warning. There's briefings, there's Great Lake levels, there's Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry flood messages for static water levels. We use different data sources where we can collect all this information on surge and wave levels. And then we have new procedures and tools and projects which are helping us with this as well. So these weekly briefings are put out as a summary of water levels and outputs to Lake Ontario. It puts current conditions into context based on previous years, max years, the min average, and average as well. And it forecasts what we can expect for the lake levels in the months to come. Great Lake water levels. So a summary for all the Great Lakes. 3 and 6 months average net basin and total net supplies. Puts conditions into context, and it's great for references. And then the flood message for static lake levels is new from the ministry. There's an interim strategy for provincial shoreline hazard messages. And the province gives us the conservation authorities, along with Lake Ontario shoreline, early warning for high lake levels. And the province utilizes information from forecasts and thresholds of conservation known thresholds of concern from conservation authorities. And then other data sources. So we have static lake level. So we can take this from the Fisheries and Oceans Canada hourly water levels. We use potential surge information and wave height as well to help predict water levels. So procedures, we have interim thresholds for issuance of lake shoreline hazard warning messages. And then we also issued a new widget this year on our website. So before 2017, our messages were pretty much focused only on rivers and streams. Now we've been able to differentiate between riverine flooding and lake flooding along the shoreline. So this is now what you'll see on our website. If you were to log on, we would have messages for rivers and streams and messages for the Lake Ontario shoreline as well. And then another study that's going to be concluded very soon is the Toronto Islands Flood Characterization and Risk Assessment Project. We've retained Baird to conduct the 4-phase flood characterization and risk assessment, and it will be completed very soon. So this looks at flood characterization, scenario inundation maps, as well as risk assessment and the shoreline hazard thresholds to develop a mitigation plan and identify mitigation options for the island to be able to hint should another flood or these steps happen again. So some of the work influenced by the flood risk assessment and ranking projects are ongoing enhancements to our flood forecasting and warning communications, flood remediation studies, and our outreach program. So this is just an image to show of some of the tools that our flood forecasting and warning team have been able to use, utilizing our flood monitoring network and relating gauge information to modeling information so that when we have gauge readings, we can see where those exact impacts would happen in certain areas, so we can help provide better information and help notify our municipalities better. Others, we can update messaging to allow for specific areas or structures risk of flooding, which is what we hope to do in the future. Ongoing assessment for additional gauges at the highest priority areas in the jurisdiction, which we now know based on the ranking. And then some of the flood remediation studies we've done, there's multiple, and you can see them at all the different areas in the jurisdiction, some of the higher remediation studies being completed. Portland's is a big one. Don Mills Channel, Malton Flood Characterization, Downtown Brampton, Elgin Mills, Vaughan Black Creek Renewal Project. And then to our outreach program. So based on the information that we have in the risk assessment, we're able to take this information and share it with not only our municipal partners, but hopefully with the public. So this year we're going to focus on, developing this outreach program centralized around informing our municipal partners about the risk and improving communications prior to, during, and following storm events. And then hopefully, partnering up with not only our municipal partners, but hopefully, Insurance Bureau of Canada and people like yourselves at Institute of Catastrophic Loss Reduction, and helping out, partnering with us to discuss, not only riverine flooding, but also urban, and where people can get resources to help themselves prepare should a flood occur. So some of the timelines for this outreach project. So last year we focused on, the work plan, engaging internal and external working groups, determining key messages, preparing the communication material. This year we plan on, in the early year, getting out to our regional municipal meetings, meeting our partners, finalizing print materials, and hopefully in the fall being able to hold some public information sessions to, educate the public about the flood vulnerable areas in our jurisdiction, and with finalizing and completing this project in March 31st of 2020. So some of the key messages we have. So we want people to really understand the risk. Why were they identified? Why are they in the flood hazard area? Is it more, are they at a high risk area, or are they at a low risk area where they're just larger but infrequent storms? We want people to be able to prepare prior to, during, and after a flood. Who do you call if you experience a flood? Can you purchase flood insurance before? What other measures can you physically prepare your properties for flooding? And then being able to stay informed, local weather conditions, paying attention to our TRCA messages, being able to, set up we want to set up a project website with all the key messages and contact information and additional resources for residents and business owners. So that's the end of my presentation. I thank you very much for listening, and we look forward to continuing on with these projects and being able to help everybody in the TRCA jurisdiction.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Rebecca. That was a great presentation. Lots of good information and good background to your work on flood risk management in the GTA. So just to remind everybody that you can ask questions anytime using that Q&A bot. I see a couple have come in, but just to give you a chance to think about questions and put them in there, or use the Q&A function. Rebecca, we have a lot of people on from different parts of the country, and one of the interesting things about Southern Ontario and the TRCA specifically is the regional storm that's used for flood management planning for floodplains, and it's somewhat considered to be much more conservative than the standards that are used in other parts of the country, like often you'll hear about a 100-year return period floodplain. Could you describe, maybe provide a little bit more detail about the differences between that Hurricane Hazel regional storm, its application in floodplain identification, and how it might differ from different jurisdictions in Canada?
Yeah, of course. Like I mentioned, Hurricane Hazel was the worst flooding we've seen in our jurisdiction in history so far. So that's technically what we use as like the regional regulatory storm event. But to understand, it's either the 100-year or the regional, whichever is worse in the area. Some areas you'll see the 100-year might be worse. But we use this because it is actually what we've seen. It's an actual historical storm event. Other areas might use the 100-year. I think for this project, we've actually classified it as the 1 in 1,000-year storm event because it's not likely to occur, but should it occur, it is going to have like a huge impact to lots of people.
Right. Okay. So if the 100-year return period event is worse in some areas, that's what's applied, and if the Hurricane Hazel storm event is worse, then it's applied, I guess, based on historical experience. And so you're considering that in the context of this specific project to be a 1,000-year return period event.
That's correct.
Right. Okay. And so that's obviously much more conservative than many other parts of the country, which typically would rely on 100-year, maybe 200-year, 500-year return period. So we do have a couple of questions. Well, first I should answer, there's a question about whether or not the presentation will be available for downloading. Our plan is, depending on Rebecca's approval, to post the presentation on our YouTube channel and make the slides available. And it's being recorded, so the verbal would be also available. So we have a question from James. So you were talking about the characteristics of your jurisdiction, specifically the Greater Toronto area. The watersheds are smaller, it's highly urbanized, so the flood events are flashy. And so we have a question from James. Given the flashiness of the riverine and pluvial basin in Toronto, are there any gaps in providing adequate 24-hour, 7-day-a-week flood warnings to citizens? So how do you handle this potentially quick onset flooding, say in sort of less ideal times, nighttime, that sort of thing?
Well, I kind of alluded to it, and thanks for bringing that up. We have a team of flood duty officers who are on staff. We have 2 people on staff on call all the time, 24/7, 365 days a year. So they are on call. They're always monitoring watershed and weather conditions, and they're monitoring. So like this week earlier, we had the rain on snow event, lots of rain, some melt as well. So they were issuing messages well into the night, and we've been known to have people, operating our infrastructure. So we have our dam operators who are on call as well. So these people are available should it anything need to be notified, or people need to be notified even in the middle of the night.
Okay, thanks for that. One question I had about, so you at the beginning of the presentation, you were talking about some of the structural flood control measures that TRCA is involved in managing some of the dams and reservoirs and so on that are involved in managing flood risk in the region. One thing that we've seen and some insurers on the line might be familiar with is, how structures are treated in flood risk or flood hazard maps. In some jurisdictions, for example, there's an assumption that those structures aren't going to be operational during a flood. And even if you're protected by a structure, you might be vulnerable to flooding. And I'm wondering how structures in TRCA's jurisdictions are treated, specifically thinking about these new detailed flood risk maps. Are they considered to be operational under every scenario, or is there, the planning consider a potential failure?
Well, having these structures in our area, yes, we do have planned for everything. They may have to be operated during, a storm event, and we do follow the operations manual set out before. There we have dam emergency preparedness plans that people can access. We distribute them to our municipal partners, and we have specific response plans should, anything at the dams occur, specifically G. Ross and Clairville Dam and some of the other Stouffville and Milne dams as well. But specifically Clairville and G. Ross Lower Dam, we operate for flood control, and we have those on our website as well. So you can go on to trcagauging.ca and see what the water levels are and flow in and out of them and that sort of information, which we have real time.
Okay, thanks. I've got another question from Jim on the line. First, the compliments presentation, very informative. His question is, have you incorporated climate change into the risk assessment, especially given the potential for changing return periods, changes in extreme rainfall events?
We have to an extent, but we do use a lot of the 1 in 1,000 year storm event is huge, and it's the regulatory storm event. So taking that into consideration, it is worse than if you would even take the 100-year and add factors on top of it. So we have taken it into consideration. We know there are more, shorter duration, higher impact storms, but, based in that we use such a high, storm event as our base, the 1 in 1,000 year storm, I think we're well over, considered for that.
Right, so it provides a pretty good safety factor. A related question. So you mentioned earlier on in the presentation some potential factors that might be driving increasing risk in the GTA. You mentioned specifically climate change, land use change, and exposure, so more property, et cetera, exposed to flooding. Does your organization have a sense of which of these factors are most important in driving potential changes in flood risk?
I think they all kind of go hand in hand together. I mean, as you urbanize more, the land use are changing, so you're getting higher runoff, but also like people are having more things, more expensive things in their homes, those type of things. I don't know that one is, more important than the other. I think they all together are collectively making it worse.
Okay. Another topic of concern, I think, for our audience here is that you mentioned urban flooding, pluvial flooding, and sort of the separation of responsibility between the municipalities and the TRCA, where you have municipalities typically responsible for extreme or sort of pluvial flooding outside of the river floodplain area. Can you give a little more information about why that's the case, why the separation of responsibilities exists? And you did mention that the two, for example, Toronto and TRCA do work together on these topics. So why do we have the separation, and what the different groups, the conservation authorities and the municipalities, are doing to work together to address both types of hazards?
Well, I think it just naturally forms what we have information on. For example, TRCA, we mandate the rivers and natural hazards in the streams, so we have the information on the flooding plains and all of that. So naturally, we have the riverine flooding. We understand it. We have that information. Similarly, the municipalities, they, have the storm sewers, so they have that information. They know where those capacity issues, they have their modeling for that sort of stuff. I think moving forward, there'll be a lot more, modeling hopefully done together, but I can't say that for sure. I would like to see that happen, but we do work together. And like I said, for a lot of these outreach things going out to the municipal partners, we would like to partner with them and really have their backing and have their support when we go out and talk to the public, so that it's, not just one side flooding. We do this. It's like collectively we're here to help you and to discuss with with the residents your flooding impact, like how you're impacted by flooding.
Okay, thanks. Another question from our online participant, Jim. So he is congratulating you on making flood risk information available to citizens. And he is commenting that in some municipalities there's reluctance to release this type of information to the public, citing the concern over changes in property values. Do you have any thoughts on that comment? You mentioned that you're going to be working toward informing residents in these areas of the flood risk information. What's the experience of the TRCA in the past releasing this type of information and dealing with property owner concerns? And what are your thoughts about dealing with potential issues when this new information becomes more widely known?
Well, we share your concern. We definitely are working towards first preparing materials for the municipal partners to educate them, and then working with them and working with other resources like Partners for Action, Intact Center, yourselves, and Institute of Catastrophic Loss Reduction, to put together, pieces of information that are really useful for the public, but also, to help educate them. We feel like putting information out there and being more transparent, people can take, understand, because homeowners and landowners, they do have a responsibility to understand the risks. If they don't understand the risks, how can they prepare for the risks, right? They can't prepare if they don't understand what they're preparing for. So on that side, I think we need to educate people. How we do it and what we tell them and how we tell them, that's still to be seen. And we hope that we learn some stuff, and we hope to take as much information from people who have done this type of education in the past. But yes, we're definitely, share concerns and want to let people know, but also understanding that there is that, piece of the puzzle where property values, and, people might not want to hear this, but it is important that they do.
Okay, sure, that sounds good. You mentioned some of the flood remediation work that's going on, especially in these high risk zones that were identified. I think Rockcliffe was mentioned as one. And I'm sure that the details of those plans will differ, but could you give a sense of the types of measures that are being considered to mitigate risk in some of these areas?
Well, I know the Rockcliffe, when they're going through all of the options, I think they're going back to basics, looking at, you know, what's feasible, what can we do, what will occur. Like they're going right back down. Some of them it's building channels, sometimes it's, you know, building a berm. Like there's lots of different things that they're looking at in order to provide this remediation. I think looking at cost value, like where can we provide the most impact. So that's kind of the studies that are going on, and that's put on by our capital projects team. So they're doing a fantastic job working with municipal partners to provide as much, you know, remediation as possible.
Sure, okay. A question about the social, so there's a number of variables that are being considered in the flood risk assessments, and you mentioned that the prioritization of these areas is based on all of these factors, impacts, the financial impacts, the infrastructure impacts, social vulnerability, and so on. I'm wondering how variables like social vulnerability would be mobilized. You know, is there a plan to, maybe the plan is not fully formed yet, but do you think there might be plans to help out specifically socially vulnerable residents? You mentioned households with incomes under $20,000. What are your thoughts on how to address these highly vulnerable residents specifically?
That one's a hard question. I think just letting the municipalities know what's there and what is at risk, that they do have these areas, educating these people, you know, if they're in the high risk area and they're, you know, in the high social vulnerability area, if they do have incomes of their house less than 20,000 and they're in a high risk area, it's going to be important for them to understand the risk and to know what to do when something occurs. Like, you know, maybe as simple as keeping valuables out of their basement so that if something happens, you know, you don't have your valuables down there. That might help recuperate and help you be able to bounce back should this occur. Investigating, you know, insurance. Can they get insurance? Maybe not in the area, you know, like that type of information. We're still trying to like work on what messaging we tell people, but I think they just need to know that they are in the risk and how to best prepare themselves and how to respond should a flood occur.
Great. Okay. So there's actually a practical question here from one of our participants, Mark. He is asking, for mapping purposes, is any of this information available as a shapefile for GIS? So available, I suppose, to the public.
Yes, it's all going to be publicly available.
Okay, and so maybe he would follow up with you directly if he wanted that information, or could it be accessed via website? Sorry.
Not all of it. Yeah, not all of it will be available publicly, but some of it will be available.
Okay. Okay, Mark, maybe you can follow up with Rebecca about that question. So you were talking earlier on in the presentation about monitoring stations. So the TRCA manages a monitoring station network. And Environment Canada also has a number of monitoring stations, Environment Climate Change Canada, in the GTA. And there's been some discussion, I think, at the national level. There's discussion from Standards Council about developing guidance for integrating climate information from different agencies. So we're not just getting the national picture from Environment Canada. Maybe some of these local stations would be valuable as well. Just curious about how you interact with Environment Canada with respect to collection of data, and if the methods are similar, and if there's any discussion about sort of linking these two groups and sharing data.
Well, you know, we're always in contact with Ontario Storm Prediction Center. We do have our own, we can access those sites, but we don't really do anything. We don't interact, like our systems don't interact together, but we do use their stations for information.
Okay. We have another question from a participant, John, and maybe this work is still ongoing, but his question is, how do you ensure property owners within a floodplain are aware of what products that you provide for them.
That's all part of our education process right now. Is we want to hopefully have a landing website where we can, educate them on what we do, but also having links to resources for what other people are offering, preparedness websites, just other information municipalities might have, Partners for Action, all the other partners themselves who have other information about, flooding, flood risk, what you can do, those types of information. We want to educate people on where they can find this, not only from us, but other sources.
Sure. Okay. So I think we're tailing off on questions online here. So first, I want to say thanks again for taking the time to prepare the presentation and present. It was extremely informative, and our plan is to provide a recording of the presentation via our YouTube channel, assuming that's okay with you, Rebecca. There's your contact information.
Yep.
Good. We met with you and others at TRCA about this work back in December, and committed ICLR would certainly work with you to the extent that we can to help develop communications plans and work with the insurance industry and our partners on making sure this information gets out to the right people and results in the right types of actions. So that was part of the intent of this presentation today. And so hopefully we can continue this discussion over the next few months, over the year. We're very happy to help and get the word out. And before we sign off, Rebecca, do you have any last comments?
No, thank you very much for having us and letting us present this information. We're really excited about some of this work that we're doing. And give us a call, contact us, email me, follow us on Twitter, contact us. If you have any other questions or want to discuss this further, we're happy to share information and figure out how we can help you as well.
Okay, great. Thanks again, Rebecca, and thanks everyone for joining. We had a good crowd today, and just a quick reminder that our next Friday Forum will be on February 22nd, and it'll be Jackie Yip from KWL who's going to be talking about sea level rise and climate change adaptation planning using uncertain data. So it should be highly relevant and interesting to our participants. So thanks again, and we'll end the webinar there.